Well, good evening. On behalf of the European Union Center of Excellence at UNC, I would like to welcome you to our roundtable discussion on immigration and identity in the U.S. and in Europe. My name is Erica Edwards, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center. Our event tonight features Michaël Privot, Director of the European Network Against Racism, an EU-wide network of NGOs working to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and promoting equality and treatment between EU citizens and third-party nationals. Michaël serves as the EU delegation's expert on Muslim-West relations, with more than a decade of experience in interreligious work and community building in Muslim communities in Europe. He is visiting North Carolina as part of the EU delegation's Building Inclusive Societies outreach program. Michaël had a jam-packed visit with us this week. He spent Wednesday at Smith Middle School speaking to about 500 students about these issues that we'll be discussing tonight. He has also visited 2 high schools and engaged UNC students in 4 different class settings. Hopefully he'll still have some energy for us tonight. When we found out Michaël would be visiting, we thought, what a great opportunity to bring together faculty from different disciplines and with different regional specializations to discuss anti-immigration sentiment, issues of citizenship and identity, minority rights, and Islamophobia. What are the similarities or differences that we see between the plight of Latinas and Muslims in the US and Muslims in Europe? Michaël will be joined tonight by 5 distinguished UNC faculty: Sahar Amer from Asian Studies, Juliane Hammer from Religious Studies, Anthony Perez from Sociology, Jeff Spinner-Havel from Political Science, and Paul Cuadros, who will be serving tonight as our moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erica. I don't see myself as much of a moderator as a facilitator for what we're all going to discuss tonight. So let me begin, and let me say thank you for coming and for participating in this important discussion, I think. I think we wanted to open this up by providing an overview of the history of immigration in the United States and in Europe, and as it pertains to these particular groups that we're discussing tonight. And so I think, Tony, I think we'll start with you. Can you provide us an overview of immigration in the United States as it pertains to Latinos here, and then we'll move on to our other panelists.
Thanks, Paul. So on one hand, we witnessed in the last 20-25 years has been a record pace of immigration, something that we hadn't seen since the early 19th century, when there were sizable waves of German and Irish immigration, and in the early 20th century when we had waves from Southern and Eastern Europe. Right? So even with the sort of recent economic downturn, in which we saw for the first time net migration from Mexico completely grind to a halt and possibly even reverse, like for the first time in 40 years, it's already in the record books. 12 million new Mexican immigrants, the single largest transfer international flow ever reported in history. No country has ever gained that many persons. No country has ever sent that many persons, with the exception of some reverse migration from former Soviet satellite states back to Russia. Right, so it's sort of a massive, massive demographic restructuring, and I think that part of some of the sort of difficult pathways to incorporation are simply a function of the sort of sheer demographic scope of what's going on. Right, so since 1980, we've seen the Latino population grow by more than 50% in every decade. Right, now standing at 51 million and counting. Right, the population share going from 6% to over 16%, right, in just a 30-year window. And those are averages. Part of, I think, what we're seeing in a lot of these sort of reactionary, xenophobic, anti-immigration policies that have been springing up in Arizona, Alabama, other places, are a reaction to regional shifts and where Latinos are migrating to. Right? So as recently as 2000, over half of all Latinos in the United States lived in just 2 states, right, California and Texas. Right? But now we're seeing sort of record population growth in places that Latinos haven't typically gone to, even states like North Carolina, right? South Carolina, the textile industry, meat packaging industry. So there's all sorts of new destinations. And what this is creating is new contacts, right, between population groups that had not been in a great deal of contact before. Right? And so I think that some of these barriers that we've seen in recent years are being fueled by these sort of previously unforeseen tensions. Right? Like all immigrants, Latinos face the sort of usual challenges when they arrive: language barrier, uneven context of reception, xenophobia on the part of the native population. Certainly, a lot of the issues that they face, I think, are compounded by the disproportionate share of undocumented status. Right? Over 50% of recent Mexican immigrants undocumented. But there's also a real important perception gap. Right? So if you take a poll of Americans and ask them what the net impact is of even undocumented migration on the economy, right, on public services, you get overwhelmingly negative views. Right? Even on things like competition for jobs, right, versus domestic workers. But if you look at all the evidence, all the hard science, like folks that have actually analyzed these issues empirically, you find that almost all of those claims are proven false. So the National Academy of Sciences has completely dispelled this sort of economic detriment method. Immigrants, even undocumented immigrants, are a net boon to the economy. Right? And we're seeing this nowhere present in the aftermath of the passage of 1070 in Arizona, similar copycat bills in Alabama and Georgia that are decimating a lot of their local economies. Right? The agricultural industry has taken a huge hit because they got rid of all their workers. Arizona took a $250 million hit to their tourism industry alone after passing these bills. So there are problems. I think they've been intensified by these recent periods of economic hardship, and that's nothing new. Just about every group that has showed up in this country and happened to coincide with an economic downturn has been blamed for the downturn, right? Whether it was, the Irish in the 19th century, the Italians or Slavs in the early 20th century, or more recently, Latinos. But if there's one constant, it's that these groups all tend to do well, particularly within a generation or two. So I think that going forward, a lot of these problems should resolve themselves.
Tony, can you pass it to Jeff? We'll just get a brief overview from each of the panelists here, and then we'll move on to some questions.
Okay, so I just, as I was listening, I've taught at the University of Nebraska for a number of years, and one year there's a small town nearby, Lexington, which opened a meatpacking plant, and the school system went from 0 Latinos to 50% Latinos in 1 year. And it just caused a lot of social problems, as you can imagine, and it was difficult for a while, but over time, I think they figured it out. But I think the story here is the right one, which is that whenever you have a massive immigration boom, this certainly happened in America in the early 20th century, it's often followed by anti-immigration sentiment, right? There's always people who are welcoming, often the business community and others, and then other people who push back. So we had in the early 20s, I'm looking at the years wrong, maybe 1920, 1924, we had anti-immigration legislation, and there's lots of anti-immigration screeds. Madison Grant was really, it's really kind of scary to read some of the stuff that he read, but if you want to have the hair turned on them. So there's often this sort of, push for immigrants, and then there's going to be a reaction. But the great thing about America, and that's repeating what we just said, is how well in the long run America does integrate its immigrants. And I think this is the challenge for Europe, actually, is how it can integrate its immigrants, particularly its immigrants from multiple countries like Africa and Asia.
So. Thank you very much. Well, I think I will. I'm by no means a specialist of immigration, so I think I will just jump the guns and go to the next point. I was just trying to give some sort of a glimpse of another challenge, which is definitely linked to this one, is about rather about identity. So I think it's an interesting phenomenon to see how we've been assisting in Europe, and I think it's also a bit in the United States, but this we will have to see this during the debate about the creation of Muslim communities and of Muslimness as an individual idea. It's well known that when people came, mostly the biggest immigration wave from the Middle East and North Africa and Europe was in the 60s, and people were just like considered and called migrant workers. And the very same people after, during the 80s, 90s, became Arabs, Turks, Pakistani. So their status had already changed in the meantime. And I would say that by the end of the 90s, they became Muslims. So that's very interesting how this terminology has been evolving and what it has been creating. And this process of ID formation, if I can say identity formation, is extremely interesting because it's some sort of a convergence between two different dynamics. And I would say four strands, indeed. There is at least first type of dynamic that was proper to Muslim communities in Europe, and where in their quest for identification, for a more positive identity, Islam and I would say Muslimness in that sense imposed itself, and we remember that in the 80s and 90s certainly, I mean most of the countries of origin were not really democracies. There was not something that people were really looking to identify themselves with. I mean there were definitely countries that were kind of problematic. So Islam, the pertaining of Islam was appearing as something like really giving sense and pride to people. So that was an internal dynamic, and then there was the external dynamic from the side of the majority community, which were at the same time noticing in the landscape an increasing number of signs, of symbols pertaining to Islam, like more mosques being visible in the landscape, mostly in Western Europe, more visible halal food outlets, more hijabs in the streets, and so on. So there was a tendency to lump all of this together under the Muslim category. So we had different logics at work, and they generated some sort of uniformized, ready-to-wear Muslim identity. But there were, what is also interesting is that those trends were reinforced by by globalization under two guises. For the majority community, it was, of course, the process of migration that led to having new populations within Europe. So there was this encounter being possible in that sense. But also, much more worryingly, there was this sharing of global images about and stereotypes about Islam. And I would just quote two, but there have been many, but certainly they have been decisive in shaping representation about Islam. It was the Salman Rushdie issue, certainly, and the Never Without My Daughter issue that everybody knows about, has been translated billions of times. So I think that in the 80s, 90s, that has been definitely shaping the mentalities. And in the minority side as well, impact of globalization, in the sense that there has been the spreading of a deculturalized form of orthodoxy and orthopraxis of Islam that has really reinforced the feeling of pertaining to some sort of emerging global community, sharing common referentials beyond the 5 pillars of the dogma. It was something very central, but here there is this kind of universal decultural Islam that, bond people together in a way. So we have some sort of 4 strands that have been reinforcing together to create a specific Muslim sort of identity. And this identity has been as much imposed upon Muslims themselves than really endorsed by Muslims themselves. So that's also very interesting. With some issues, and I would just like to finish on that. I would like to remind the example of the former president of my organization, of INAR, Bashir Qureshi. So he's himself a very interesting mix of, he was Pakistani, but born under the Indian rule, so it was before the partition. So he moved to all places. He came study to in the US, and then he moved to Denmark, and he arrived in Denmark in '67. Has been, Islam was absolutely not part of his identity, really. I mean, I think he's a non-believer. I mean, it doesn't mean anything at the end of the day. But he was not considering himself as a Muslim. But at some point, at the end of the 90s, and specifically after 9/11, it was imposed on him that he was a Muslim So really for him, it was a shock. It was like, I'm not praying, I'm not going to mosque, I'm not a Muslim. Yes, you are a Muslim, right? And because of he was categorized as such, this identity was imposed on him, he was also facing Islamophobia as a result. And unwillingly, I mean, reluctantly, he had to really start fighting against this very actively, and he spent the last 10 years of here, the last decade, going all over Europe, really trying to raise awareness about the impact of Islamophobia on his very own life, also till today. He said, I'm Muslim, it's not my faith, I mean, but he really feels this fear because it's a, well, at the end of the day, it's imposed, and we don't have to do with it, to deal with that.
I'm just realizing that roundtables are like TV interviews. You have like 30 seconds to get your point across, and what's obviously getting lost there is the nuance. So I'm really concerned about whatever I'm going to be able to say in those 2 minutes. My work focuses on American Muslims, not only women, men too. A lot actually, and I think that's important. So there are a lot of things that come to mind. So the first one would be that in the context of the US, to talk about Muslims as immigrants in itself is already problematic for a number of reasons. Of course, voluntary immigration of people from Muslim-majority countries goes back to the late 19th century and is preceded by the forceful migration of African Muslim slaves to the Americas. We have, I don't know, I think the wave terminology when we talk about immigration itself, I think is really problematic because it sort of suggests that we're overrun by these people who are sort of different and problematic. So there has been immigration post-1965, which lifted restrictions on many of the countries that are Muslim-majority countries. There was a downturn in immigration from Muslim-majority countries after 9/11 because of increased restrictions that has sort of bounced back, even though there are still more restrictions on people from Muslim-majority societies. But of course, we also have to remember that if we believe statistics, about 30% of American Muslims are African American. And those are the ones that usually get forgotten in debates about Islam because it's much easier to represent Islam as a foreign religion if most Muslims are foreigners. Of those who are of immigrant background, over 60% are foreign born. So in that community, there's certainly something to be said for many of them being recent immigrants. Of course, we also have a significant percentage of people who are third, fourth, and fifth generation. And what Michael just described, I think, is to a degree true in the American context too. That there is a way in which Muslims become Muslims, both from the inside by recognizing in the American context that self-representing as Muslims, as a religious community, can actually be a political advantage in terms of representation in numbers. Of course, the dynamic is different because religion in the public sphere functions very differently in America from how it does in Europe, and so there is an argument to be made for that, and it works actually pretty well in the 1990s. Of course, 9/11 makes it immediately very problematic to be Muslim. That's why we talk about Islamophobia, but we're also talking about state policies that make it much more complicated. And so in the context of the post-9/11 backlash, we have a sort of recovery or construction of Muslim identity that has nothing to do with religious practice. So it's an identity that is both imposed from the outside on everybody who looks like they could be Muslim, and something that people take up in response to that. And I'm going to stop there.
Okay. I work on, among other things, veiling in France and Muslim identities in France. And so I think Michaël has already said quite a bit of what I was going to say, so let me just point to maybe a couple of additional elements to add to what he said, which is the construction of the category Muslim by the end of the 1990s. is also, we can see it's emerging probably to a new law that was voted in 1974, which is the family reunification law. Before 1974, and from the Second World War up to the 1970s, the immigration in France in particular was mostly male. They had come to work to reconstruct France that was destroyed from the war. And so it was mostly men, and they didn't think that they were going to stay very long. But in 1974, there's the family reunification law that basically brought in for the first time large numbers of women in France, and I think that also helped shape differently the landscape and the constitution, the composition of those immigrants, of those laborers, of those migrant workers, and I think that also helped fuel all of the debate that I'm sure you all heard about veiling and the public display of Islamic dress, of Muslim women's dress in the public sphere, followed, of course, most notably in 2004 by the law that banned all ostentatious public signs in schools, but that, interestingly, in the media and in popular discourse is referred to as the law against veiling. So it's supposed to ban all religious ostentatious signs. So, in other words, a big cross, not a small cross. Of course, the big is never really quite defined, but a big cross or a Jewish kippah. They had never thought about the Sikh turban. But ultimately all of these were encompassed under this law, but it was very clear to everybody that this law was really targeting the Muslim population and Muslim women's clothing. And of course in 2010, the additional step which was taken to ban the niqab, the burqa, which is the face veil, the full covering that leaves only the eyes open, from all public spaces. So this is not just schools, but even from the streets, from the stores, from government buildings, etc. So I think that the categorization of Muslims, I guess I would like to just emphasize also the dimension of gender inequity that it leads to in there. And the other thing that I wanted to also mention is that Muslims are coming from mostly France's former colonies, which means, for the most part, for the ones in France, North Africa, but also Sub-Saharan Africa in large numbers, and also Turkey. And these people who have been in France for 3-4 generations are still referred to in the media as immigrants. Okay? And they're called immigrants because they're Muslims. They're not called immigrants because they just have arrived or because they're really an immigrant status. They're called immigrants in order to emphasize, once again, this opposition between Muslims and Français de souche, the French from roots, with French roots from anybody can help me here?
Ethnic French.
Blood, right, thank you. With French stock, right, French from French stock. With French blood, okay? So obviously Muslims don't have that French stock, even though all of these Muslims that we're talking about also have French citizenship. And also they forget and they overlook the number of converts to Islam. And they also overlook all of the Eastern European Muslims who have now become part of the European landscape. And so I think by continually emphasizing their immigrant status, they also emphasize the fact that they are opposed to what the European secular system stands for.
I'm going to navigate this chord carefully. Some fascinating stuff here. I think, the reporting that I've done here in North Carolina has been mostly in the rural parts of North Carolina, and where we've seen migration of people from Mexico and Central America, mostly to work in the food processing industry. And from there, the community members that I've met, mostly young people, have struggled to integrate into their communities, into their towns, and And those towns have also struggled to welcome those same folks who come and work in their communities and provide labor. And I guess one of the things, of course, I'm wondering here is what are the challenges that Latinos and Latinas and Muslim men and women face here in the United States and in Europe today? So, Tony, I'm going to start with you and we'll pass this around again, since that seems to be the best way to kind of navigate just this one microphone.
So challenges, gosh, where to start? In many ways, I think a lot of the challenges so commonly this is sort of framed as using language like sort of immigration issue, immigration problem. In most instances, it's usually these sort of reactionary attitudes and policies that create, in many instances, certainly exacerbate some of the underlying tensions. The immigrants themselves, if you look, at a sort of cross section of the sort of characteristics, you find all sorts of positive things. Highest labor force participation of any racial ethnic group, at least Hispanic males. Fairly low crime rates, positive selectivity on a host of sort of socioeconomic outcomes, right? We have all these sort of paradoxes among Latinos in which their outcomes tend to be better on average than their native-born peers at the same level of social class. Right? And yet you look at a lot of these struggles, particularly I think in these sort of new immigrant receiving destinations that don't have a lot of history. Right, of sort of incorporation of immigrants, and in some cases the populations are growing very, very quickly, right, and there are sort of struggles for, city services to absorb populations, for schools, health services, and whatnot. A lot of it seems to be fueled by very, very strong misperceptions, particularly around economic competition, right, and competition for limited resources. To be sure, right, there have been instances fairly high-profile instances of what we call ethnic succession, right, where immigrants have been used. And this is not just common to Latinos, but lots of immigrant groups throughout U.S. history where an immigrant workforce considered sort of more malleable, easier to exploit, pay lower wages, will be brought in, right, to try to sort of undercut native workers. And to be sure, there are some instances where this happens, right, in particular locales. Right? But in the aggregate, right, so if we look at these things regionally, nationally, right, none of these sort of short-term trends ever hold up in the long run, in part because immigrants are also very entrepreneurial, right? 3 times the rate of their own, starting up their own businesses as other groups, right? And they tend to create, in many instances, as many jobs, right, as they wind up taking. To be sure, in survey after survey, asking Americans whether or not they feel like there's direct competition for their jobs, many will say that there is. And yet, when the immigrants leave, right, either through forced deportation or restrictive policies, many of these jobs remain unfilled. Even here in the height of the Great Recession, a lot of folks in the agricultural industry and building services, after losing their immigrant populations, simply cannot find workers to take these jobs. Right? So even with the record unemployment that we keep hearing about, right? There are still some jobs that Americans simply don't want to work, right? But a lot of Latino immigrants will gladly do, as have many first-gen immigrants throughout history, sort of taking the jobs that weren't popular in large part so that their children and their children's children could have a better life, right? Sort of starting their pathway to upward mobility. I think as far as sort of direct challenges now, I think these legislative issues were sort of really sort of unexpected. I think the economic impact may give a lot of states pause in thinking about whether or not they want to copy these particular laws, particularly given how detrimental and counterproductive they've been. So in the Arizona case, the claim was that undocumented workers were consuming up to $2 billion a year, right, in public services. Right? That's a big number. $2 billion a year can contribute massively to a state's fiscal budget. The problem is, those same immigrants, it's estimated, if they're all driven from the state of Arizona, will remove $43 billion in economic output from that state. 500,000 jobs will be shed. Right? Schools hemorrhaging students, neighborhoods being depopulated. Right? So to save a couple $1 billion, right, states are willing to risk potentially 10, 20 times as much economic backlash. I think if folks are willing to be objective, right, and actually consider the long-term forecast, one would hope that that would sort of dampen the enthusiasm for a lot of these very anti-immigrant and ultimately sort of anti-growth policies.
Let me say one thing, so I don't, so there's lots of other things to say. And I'm happy to, so let me just say one thing about Europe, which is, I think, a large problem, and others here can probably say more about this, which is high unemployment rates, particularly high unemployment rates among youth, not just Muslim youth, but certainly, particularly Muslim youth, is just a massive barrier to integration and ending prejudice. It keeps people impoverished. It prevents them from integrating into the larger society. It increases prejudice. The problem is the solution to the unemployment rate, and particularly the youth unemployment crisis in Europe, is not around the corner. And I think that this is not just a short-term problem, but perhaps even a medium-term problem that Europe's going to have. And although our economy is not particularly robust now, it's much better. I mean, the youth unemployment rates in some of the European countries, I can't even think now, 25, 30%? 40%. So it's just way more. I mean, it's just a different league than what we're experiencing here. And so because of that, and the people who are first fired are going to be immigrants, often Muslim immigrants, and the people who are last hired are going to be Muslim immigrants. So this is going to be this is a structural problem, economic structural problem right now that we don't really have in the United States, not to the deep extent. And I don't think the immigration difficulties that Europe faces can really be dealt with adequately until this difficult structural problem can also be. This is not the only problem, causing prejudice and difficulties for Muslim immigrants. There's lots of other problems, but this is one that I just really want to highlight because I think it's very difficult to get around, and it's just going to be with Europe for quite some time.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. I think I should bring you back to Europe so that you can help us convince the politicians to make that point. I would say, yeah, definitely. I think that employment is definitely a big issue as well. We see differences between southern and northwest countries. In southern countries like Spain, Italy, Greece, still, and Malta, and Cyprus, still, yes, we face first generation so-called Muslims. And definitely they are the first to be laid off and those kind of things. So we've been facing this in Spain. When it comes to countries from northern up, I mean like from older migration, basically all those who had the first big importation of labor in the 60s, and the UK, the situation is different because then We are talking about the second, third, and fourth generation of young people. They are born there, they are citizens of the country, and I agree. I mean, that what we really see there is a massive failure of the education system, basically, to have been able to provide those young people with the appropriate skills to face, to move forward. I mean, they've been, while ghettoized would be strong, segregated would be definitely too strong as well, but they ended up in schools that were not of the best quality for different reasons, where the most committed teacher don't go because difficult classes and everything. And I mean, it was also at the time after the 70s where there had been massive cuts in educational spendings and so on, which means that the choice was not made to put the necessary resources to really give the extra push, extra support as those kids were necessitating. And I mean, we keep repeating. I mean, if we take specifically as a city like Brussels, for example, which is a good example there, where you have up to 40% of the population that can be identified as having some sort of Muslim background, sociologically, culturally, whatever you want. And it's a massive pocket of poverty within the society. 50% of Arab and Turk communities in Brussels are living below the poverty line. But at the same time, we keep on saying, well, look, guys, you have two solutions. Either you do some sort of Marshall Plan and you invest the billions of euro needed to really train those kids. I mean, but not only kids, but even the 25s and 30s. With the necessary language skills, because many of the jobs opportunities are around Brussels in the Flemish-speaking area, and most of the kids have been learning French within Brussels. So there is already a big deficit there. So train them and really go into vocational training, whatever. So put the price for it, but no one really wants to do this. So basically, the untold choice of the politicians is that we're going to leave those kids or those youngsters on social money or unemployment money, and just try to control them as much as we can, but we know that they have no future. So basically, the choice is to have a pocket of poverty there that we know will never solve, but we keep on putting pressure on them, try to find a job, but not really giving the opportunities. And I think it's really something that is not acceptable. Nobody would say, yes, that's the truth. Of course, I think they would never get any kind of support if they were obviously saying that. But yeah, I think that de facto this is the kind of choice which is, or non-choice, which is being made. But definitely, I think that we see similar factors in the UK, like young Pakistani and Bangladeshi young men are 2.5 times more likely to get employed than the majority white kids. And in the Netherlands, for example, to get the first job, it takes 8 times more for young Dutch from Moroccan background, i.e. identified as Muslim, than the majority white Dutch. So, I mean, it takes really a lot of things, and this is the few countries where we have figures. I mean, the big issue in Europe is that we don't have proper data collection. But definitely, what I would like to see beyond, of course, employment, definitely. I mean, this is what we try to advocate as our organizations. They give everyone a good job with a good pay. I mean, so we don't want more working poor, but more people having a decent income and chances in life. But obviously, in the current context, as Jeff was mentioning, this is certainly unlikely to happen anytime soon. But what we see then is that really what the biggest challenge then is for those young Muslims in your second, third generation to really be able that they are given the right to carve their own path to modernity according to their own way. And I think that would be the best gift that we could give them, putting in place this, so that they can really build at peace their identity, their references, and mobilizing what they want, and avoiding the kind of two gaps that we face for the young men, which are really looks, and there has been a very interesting study from the European Fundamental Rights Agency, trying to look at the perceived discrimination, specifically on Muslims. This is the EU-NITIS data. And the most likely to be discriminated against are the young men aged 16 to 24. And then the patterns where the feeling of discrimination is decreasing, and the elder you are, actually the less likely you are to feel discrimination, kind of. So definitely they are identified as young men as the dangerous class that needs to be controlled one way or the other. And for women, one definitely of the thing is, being able to live their own life as they are, as they choose to be, practicing, wearing the veil, whatever they want to do, and change their mind if they want to change their mind, and not being constantly brought back to their Muslim identity. Knowing this, and this is something that I've been sharing with other audiences, that a recent study of Islamophobic case of Islamophobia in France, date 2011, shows that 92% of cases of Islamophobia are targeted against women, which makes Islamophobia an extremely gender-biased type of violence. And this is committed both by male and female from the majority community, but also both by male and female from the minority community, which is also generating another things, and I will just stop here, a big move, a change also in the attitudes over the maybe, 20, 30 years, is that previously, when we were listening to civil rights activists from ethnic diverse ethnic minority backgrounds, they were saying at least we were at peace within our communities. And now it's not the case anymore. So you're never at peace. I mean, there is no community where you can say, okay, I'm among my folks, and I don't have to fear to be victimized one way or the other. So even within Muslim communities, you can be victimized as a Muslim because you make different choices. And of course, you have all here the whole spectrum of choices that you can imagine.
Sometimes I wish I was a social scientist. People always want those numbers and those studies. Here's why I'm skeptical about that. So just for the number of Muslims in the US, our studies range from 1.2 to 12 million. That's incredibly helpful, isn't it? 1.2 to 12 million. And the cop-out is to say, we think it's about 6 to 7 million, but we're really not sure. We have no idea. And then the next question is sort of to say, well, how do you count them, right? So like, how do you know? So I'm realizing that some of the sort of more qualitative arguments are more difficult to make because they don't come with studies like that. If I can bring in one, the Pew Survey of American Muslims in 2007 was titled, mostly middle class and mostly mainstream, as describing their economic status in American society and as in describing their political views as non-extremist, i.e. terrorist. In terms of, so there you have a challenge. They had to title it that way because Pew was trying to make the argument that most Muslims are really nothing to worry about. In terms of challenges, there are a number. One thing that sort of came to my mind after I finished speaking in the first round is that part of this discussion of the acquisition of Muslim identity from the outside in the US context also has to do with what some scholars describe as racialization, which is both has to do with the way race categories and racial relations are discussed and defined in the American context, but it also has to do with the idea that there is something inherent and unchanging about Muslims. So the racialization has to do with the idea that being a Muslim means that you have like a racial / cultural / religious kind of essence that you can't shed, that you have no control over, which in turn feeds Islamophobia because it rests on the assumption that Muslims as a group of people, especially Muslim men, are dangerous because they're Muslim, and the Muslimness can't go away. So Michaël was sort of pointing to you don't have a choice about your Muslimness, it's there. And so in terms of the experiences of American Muslim men and women, in those polls that have been done, most of them report either experiences of discrimination, mostly verbal. There are fewer violent incidents than in the European context, but of course one of those is enough to create fear in all the other ones. And if it's not direct experiences with discrimination, which a majority of Muslims report when they're polled, it's fear of discrimination. It's fear of being treated differently because of the way they look and are identified. And of course, post 9/11, the largest number of hate crimes was committed against Muslim women because there were Muslim women wearing hijab, wearing the veil, because they're most easily identified as Muslim women, as Muslims, as part of the Muslim community. And I also want to point out, and this is a whole other question, part of the issue that I have with the way we talk about Islamophobia is that we often talk about it as this sort of thing that happens. In the American context, Islamophobia is actively utilized as a tool by politicians on both sides of the aisle for a variety of purposes. And so it's not just something that, it's not like, I think it's similar with Latino immigration. There are concerns that people have, but a lot of it is what politicians do with people's fears and people's concerns. And this is when you have incidents like you've had in the last year or two. Arson in mosques is on the rise. Just the day before yesterday, another mosque burned down in Toledo, Ohio. Incidents in which women are attacked, but also Quran burning sessions like in Florida. Those are all things that are fueled by political debates that use Muslims and the fear of Islam as tools for, like in mid-election in 2010, the famous quote-unquote Ground Zero mosque. So I think it's important to recognize that it's not sort of a thing that happens when people in society don't know other people, but that there is a clear political agenda that is in play. And I think any sort of attempt to address that needs to take into consideration how very well planned some of those incidents are.
Okay, is there anything else to add now? Okay, thank you. Okay. To add to the list of woes that have been described, I'd like to maybe give a little bit also some specifics about the types of discrimination and the type of discrimination faced by Muslims, but also that are part of the structural problems that seem to be, there seems to be a desire not to solve some easy problems. So, for example, unemployment, absolutely a huge problem in France. The Islamophobic incidents from within the Muslim community against anyone who is perceived to follow rituals or adopt behaviors that are not fully endorsed by the majority Muslim community also would face Islamophobic incidents. But I'd like to point to, again, a couple of studies or a couple of incidents that show the difficulty of dealing with these challenges. When the law against ostentatious religious symbols was voted, the way it came to be voted in 2004 is that there was a commission that was set up by the president, which was called the Stasi Commission, that was trying to find ways to integrate the Muslim population. They were recognizing, well, there is a problem, what do we do for it? And the Stasi Commission came up with dozens of recommendations in order to better integrate the Muslims. Only one of their recommendations had to do with the veil, with the hijab, and that's the only one that got adopted. Now, if we look at the other recommendation that they made, maybe there would have been some sense into at least examining them or taking them seriously. For example, they offered that maybe serving an alternative to pork in school cafeteria could be helpful, since Muslims don't eat pork, so that they could eat. I mean, that seemed like an easy solution. And yet that easy solution was not even deemed as an effective means. And I can say from a personal, on a personal note, my sister lives in France. She has 2 young daughters in school age, and she is always fighting with the school cafeteria so that they wouldn't feed them pork, or they would at least tell her that they're feeding them pork so that she could give them something else to eat. So that's another, that's one aspect. extending the cafeteria hours in universities during Ramadan, the month of fasting, when people eat only at sunset, so sunset might occur after the cafeteria has closed, so they recommended maybe extending those hours. Even that also was rejected. They also suggested maybe setting a special holiday for the Muslims, like observing some of their holidays, that it would be permitted for Muslims to take the day off. And they also said that that was not possible, it was rejected. And so I think that these might appear to be like small things, but I think small things add to a feeling of disenfranchisement and feeling that they're not being heard, they're not being listened to, that nobody is really helping them. So I think that that's something that I think is important to keep in mind. And then the other thing that I want to point out is a study, again, a social scientist study that I didn't do, but that was done by the Sciences Politiques, Political Science Association in Paris, and that they published a book, and the book has just been translated into English in 2011. And the title of the book is very interesting because it's called "As French as Everyone Else?" ? And of course, the goal of this book is to examine through various interviews and through various documents and self-reporting whether Muslims from African and from Turkish background behaved any differently from the rest of the French population. And what they discovered, to their, but not to their great surprise, but probably to the general politicians and media and popular voices' surprise, is that no matter what social group or what age or what background those Muslims were coming from, they didn't behave any differently in any of the measures that the French kept saying these are important measures than for the regular French population. And yet, I think one of the biggest challenges for Muslims living in Europe is certainly to defend their right to be Muslim and citizen of whatever country they're in.
One thing to add,
Yeah.
question. So, can you hear me without the mic?
Yes.
So, one of the things we have in America has always been, not always, but often, the business community has been often pushed to allow more immigrants to come in because they want low-wage labor. So you had one very important political group, that advocated for immigrants to some degree, and I wonder maybe that's not true in Europe, and so that would be another important difference that's worth. And also, business groups are obviously tend to be more conservative as well, so it can. Sometimes sort of alleviate some of the sort of natural places where anti-immigrant sentiment comes from. So maybe in Europe we don't have these.
No, there is. I mean, there are several. There's no equivalent group like To Care, for example, in France or in Europe. Right? Yeah. And so I think that's definitely there isn't any advocacy group like that. There are other grassroots organizations, but oftentimes the ones that seem to be taken seriously and heard by politicians and quoted in the media and shown on TV all the time are the groups that support the government perspective.
Right.
They're not the groups that may actually be working at more local levels or even at larger European levels to build a coalition among Muslims, more progressive Muslims or different voices of Muslims to come in the debate. So the only ones that you keep hearing are a group like Ni Pute Ni Soumise, Neither Whore Nor Submissive, that maybe some of you have heard of, a French group, a feminist group, and headed by Muslims and Arab Muslim women. And so, and they have been extremely powerful in supporting every step of the government in order to uphold bans against veiling, of the veiling of Muslim women, saying that absolutely a veil is a repressive piece of clothing and that shows the subordination of women, and that the French state must support women anywhere, and so therefore must support French women by banning their veil. And that's the only voice really that has been heard, and of course it turns out that the government sponsors this group. And so, of course, they're going to be saying those voices. But there are other, I mean, I've worked on other grassroots organization, feminist group, who are saying the opposite, who are trying to make another voice heard and who are being very active at local levels and working with the schools in trying to influence more local governance. But that voice is never heard. You hear it only if you go on the ground and interview.
Okay, just to answer Jeff's question maybe more directly, I think it's we have different tendencies there in terms of the business community. Well, first in terms of, let's say, take first the angle of diversity management, right? It's definitely not at all to the extent that we see diversity management in the US. I mean, it's still very new, and it's very interesting that when they talk about diversity management and the necessity to have a more diverse workforce, it focuses specifically on gender, age, and a little bit of disability. Ethnic and religious diversity is completely out of the picture. I mean, really is the most touchy topic, and they go, oh, no, we just focus on gender. I mean, you know, ethnicity, disability, but people, we don't like, and I don't know how is it in the US, but mainly in Europe, I mean, we are really trying to work with the businesses on that. I mean, you have, as much as the headquarters, in terms of I would say, commercial policies have the right to impose everything to the subsidiaries, to the national branches, in terms of diversities, it basically have nothing to say. So we are dealing with the European diversity managers. They are full of good intentions, all whites, by the way. And when it comes to trying to get their national branches to do something, no way. I mean, so there is already, in terms of concept, necessity to have a more diverse workforce, it's not really moving. I mean, that's one thing. Now, in terms of getting migrants, yes, indeed, they know that they need migrants. I mean, that's something that, I mean, I had read figures, I'm not sure anymore, but I think that it's really hundreds of thousands of migrants for the next 20 years to be able to not even improve our standards of living, just maintain what we have now. So, and it's completely outside of the debate.
Because of the aging population.
On the one hand, yes, but also the need of the industry. And I mean, one good example is Germany, where they are losing, the labor market is losing every year dozens of thousands of workers that are not replaced. So I mean, the SMEs, for example, really feel that the economy is starting to shrink in Germany. But the discourse of the government is no migration, right? So there is even a disconnect within the business community. But when, like in Denmark, they obviously want to have more migration, is migration from countries where people are more like us, i.e. from the east, Romania, Bulgaria, but not even, it could be maybe Ukraine, could also be outside of the EU, but definitely not Africa, and definitely not Middle East and so forth. So there are, again, tensions there. So the business community might do the argument, but it might not go in the direction that we necessarily want.
This was one I was actually going to ask about, especially given the previous comments you made about long resident Muslims in France. It's been there 2, 3, 4 generations, still being referred to as immigrants. Well, why would that be the case? Particularly sort of, post-racial, cosmopolitan like Europe, where they don't have these silly Americanized categories. Right? Why would something like that happen? And I actually think that the failure of a lot of these European projects to actually take on and attend seriously to not just race, but racialization, right? The attribution and ascription of sort of otherness to, ostensibly non-racial categories. And the truth is, it's one thing we're very good at here in the States. It's cataloging and categorizing people into, subclasses. Now, we do these for a number of reasons, right? Some of them are these sort of statutory requirements for statistical reporting purposes, but it's also a function of our historical legacy, right? A legacy rooted in some very sort of ugly forms of discrimination, race prejudice, right, from sort of genocide, forced migration of our indigenous peoples to the West African slave diaspora. And I think that even now, if we look at a lot of these issues of Islamophobia here in the States, one can't help but wonder how much it intersects with just garden variety xenophobia and even race ethnic prejudice. So in the 90s, part of the reason we don't have good numbers, I never thought I would defend the Census Bureau. I spend so much time criticizing them. For once, I'll play the contrarian. there was a huge review in the 1990s to talk about adding a new census category called Middle Eastern or Arab. Right? The idea being that 10 million or so, well, somewhere between 1 and 10 million folks that live in this country, that if they're not likely to be perceived as white, does it make sense to classify them as such? Right? One could certainly argue that a lot of the folks, who were beaten or killed in the aftermath of 9/11, by these crazy folks, probably weren't benefiting very much from their sort of co-ethnic white status with the people who were beating and killing them. Right? This sort of nonsense, this idea of putting under this umbrella folks that are not likely to be perceived as similar in any way, shape, or form. And although it was a one-vote defeat in the 1990s to add this separate category, and that's why we still count folks of Middle Eastern descent as white, what struck me was that in a lot of the advisory panels, suggestions from the public were to make the category Muslim or Arab. I mean, that is, at its surface, as nonsensical as saying something like, we want a category called Christian and Chinese, right? A religious category and an ethnic origin pulled under a similar heading. But if we look, right, at everything, not just from a lot of the way I think that Muslims are racialized in the mass media, but also in the public consciousness. Juliane had mentioned the targeting of Muslim women in the aftermath of 9/11, but you know who else was targeted? I think of the sort of dozen or so folks killed, weren't 7 of them Sikhs who weren't Muslim at all?
Muslims wear turbans.
Right? Didn't we just have, wasn't there a high-profile shooting in Minnesota or Wisconsin maybe, a month ago, where I think a Sikh church was attacked? So in this case, right, if race is very much in the eye of the beholder, and religious cleavages, subtle differences in ethnicity are being glossed over in the eyes of, perpetrators of prejudice and xenophobia, is it a problem? This sort of European reaction to do these sort of, head in the sand thing and say, well, we're not going to go there. We're not going to talk about race ethnicity if it seems that the people are more than willing to do that and to treat Muslim minorities as potentially racial or ethnic others, right? In spite of these sort of sort of civic nationalist definitions that, are trumped in public.
So this has nothing to do with the business community question anymore, except that it does, because I'm concerned, and this might be really naive of me, about some of those arguments about how immigrants and or Muslims are good for the economy, in the sense that I think it also absolves societies from talking about anti-racism as a value in itself, aside from whether immigrants and refugees and foreigners are good for their societies. And so what if it turns out that in Arizona, for example, they're not good for the economy anymore? Then what? Then the profiling and the kicking them out and the discrimination are okay? Does that make it any better, right? So there's sort of a way in which arguing for a more inclusive society in which we incorporate people regardless of what skin color they are or what background, and where we don't assume that people who have different cultural practices, and of course in the American context this is particularly ironic because yes, it is an immigrant society and everybody at one point or the other, except for Native Americans, came from somewhere else, but not all cultures are the same, right? So we have, the concern that is raised is that some people are more different than others. So Latinos don't integrate because they insist on speaking Spanish, even though that's not the language of America. And Muslims have cultural traits or treat their women differently. That's the most cited reason for why Muslims are different and not American and can't be American, is that they treat their women differently. The women are also not agents in that conversation. They're the people that are talked about for the most part. So I think Islamophobia is also related to, is gendered in the ways in which the conversation is always about women, but hardly ever with women about their issues. So coming back to this concern I have, is, again, this might be politically really naive, but I wonder if it's not possible to argue that there is value in integrating people and accepting people with their differences, and try to not argue with their utility in society, other than that diversity should be a good thing in and of itself. And I wanted to point out one thing about Middle Easterners as being white. Two things, actually. One is there was a group of Arab Americans who lobbied before the last census, again, for a separate category, which is very interesting in terms of political representation. But it's also interesting that in the 1910s and 1920s, we have a significant number of cases where people went to court to argue that they should be naturalized as Caucasian, of Middle Eastern background, some Christian and some Muslim, and what you see there is a really interesting negotiation of racial categories, because the arguments they make go along the lines of, well, I'm from Syria, which is right next to Jerusalem, and Jesus was from there, so clearly we must be white. And what it turns out, people who have looked at these cases find that it's in the discretion of particular judges to make those decisions, and they're made differently. So two Yemenis, one gets citizenship because he comes from the Middle East and that's where white people come from, so we know. And another one whose skin is darker and who's Muslim turns out to not be white enough to get citizenship on that basis. So it's a very interesting sort of negotiation of these categories that, and you see that in the challenging of the census categories too, the idea that those aren't actually set in stone at all, and that they have been negotiated. And the reason why Arab Americans want their own category is because they want minority status that comes with certain forms of legal inclusion, and if they're not separately identified, then they can't sort of fall back on those.
Ask a question on the panel?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay. I am just curious in this discussion that you, with these comments that were made, how would Islamophobia then, how does it affect those Hispanics who are converting to Islam? Which is also another large category that is growing in the U.S. And so, well, it's a growing group of but still, so are they considered Latinos or are they considered Muslims? I mean, how?
It still be considered, because technically, the federal government can't measure, at least in any of its censuses or large-scale surveys, religion is barred. In fact, if, for years there were write-ins on census forms where people would write in Jewish, right, or other religious categories under, their racial and ethnic labels, and those were all recoded, reassigned, usually to white, for whatever reasons, this is the default assumption, or ignored altogether.
Okay, I'm going to move on here and ask the panel, anybody can take this one on, but the economic downturn here and in Europe, how's it affected anti-immigrant or Islamophobia for Latinos and Muslims? Anyone want to grab this one? Tony?
So this one's easy, right? Even in the best of times, there's always some challenges in incorporating new people, right, into the population. But if you have a change in economic conditions, at the same time you have a change in demographic conditions, and the economic change is not a good one, even the most well-intending people can't help but associate the two things. Well, look, the economy's in the gutter, I'm out of work. Oh, it's because we have all these Mexicans that moved into town. Well, naturally, right? It's not because of the global recession that started in Wall Street. Let's not get carried away, right? It has to be, the newcomers' fault, right? And to be sure, all of these sort of xenophobic waves that we've had in this country, the ones that have coincided with economic downturns, have been deeper, more pronounced, uglier in terms of the sort of legislation that came about, right? Than ones that have happened when there have just been big migratory flows, but not an economic down cycle. Right? And we see this from everything from the Chinese Exclusion Act, right, to the restrictive anti-immigrant quotas that were passed in the aftermath of World War I. Right? If it's an economic contraction, at the same time there's lots of immigration going on, people tend to associate the two. Right? And to be sure, there was I think, evidence the sort of anti-immigrant backlash, something that had been fomenting long before the housing bubble burst and the sort of recent recession really caught on in full. But part of that was primed by sort of congressional failures to pass comprehensive immigration reform. There were some very widespread rallies here in 2006 in places like Chicago, Los Angeles, where you had hundreds of thousands of Latinos sort of in the streets sort of protesting. And there was a lot of imagery, I think, that sort of sensationalized in the media then that sort of, I think, primed pumps, if you will, for this sort of current xenophobic wave. And then when you compound things with the economic down cycle, which hit Latino workers, particularly undocumented workers, very, very hard because they were predominantly concentrated where? Building services and construction, right? Two of the industries that experienced the deepest and most immediate slowdown. Right? Of course, in sort of normal sort of market flows, the migrant workers could go back, right? Return migration, they could return to Mexico, but somebody got the bright idea to build a border fence for several hundred miles, not really realizing that it was not only going to make it harder for people to get into the country, it was going to make them harder to leave. And most conservative estimates of the net effect on return migration in constructing the border fence is that it reduced the ability, or reduced return flows to Mexico and Latin America by 75%, essentially trapping undocumented workers here, knowing that it would only make it that much harder, right, if they ever did want to return. So, all this to say, the sort of economic down cycle, I think the timing of the down cycle with the sort of current immigration dynamics, they serve to compound, I think, one another in the worst of possible ways. I think the best hope that we have now is that because the need, I think, for economic recovery is so great, and the evidence on what these clearly racist, xenophobic policies are doing to the magnitude and character of the economic recovery, particularly in the states that have, had the bright ideas to pass these laws. I think that's probably the best hedge that there is. That now is simply not the time to either deport or tramp down on tens of thousands of your workers, consumers, and taxpayers.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add than what I've already said. So,
But from Europe, the economic downturn.
Let's go for Europe. No, I think actually I would share in terms of patterns. I mean, we meet very much the same in Europe. Also, I mean, as I was mentioning, I mean, by and large, immigration is really now at one of the lowest since years due to the very restrictive policies that have been put in place in Europe. Now, in terms of impact on Muslim communities, it's a bit different in the sense that yeah, we are talking mostly of people there for many generations. So it's only in the south that there were rather new arrivals, and they're still in the first generation. And then what we've seen is in Spain, but it's already started, yes, in 2009, when we have first figures of Moroccans that had also acquired the Spanish citizenship, moving either back to Morocco or moving up because they benefit from, of course, the EU citizenship. So this has also created tensions, for example, in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, where you had Spanish Moroccans moving up and then landing on the same labor market, then their fellow Moroccans, Belgian Moroccans, Dutch Moroccans, and so then it created even tensions within the communities because of this intra-EU migration. So that's interesting to see how things are developing in that area. I just was willing also to come back to two things that Juliane said about the possibility to argue a business case, a human rights case for say migrants or people. Of course, I mean people don't have to prove their economic value to be able to be there. I mean we are still trying as a human rights organization to articulate this case, but it's extremely difficult. People are convicted, but of course, in terms of recession and crisis, I mean, it's very difficult to be on the business case argument that we still need to make. And it's also very interesting to see that the whole, I would say, anti-discrimination drive, yes, fundamental rights drive within the EU has always been a business case. I mean, it has never ever been, I mean, for the European Union, a case for human rights per se. I mean, when our members at the time managed to get the legal base and then the landmark equality directives in 1997 and 2000, it was only for the sake of facilitating the mobility of workers, so that they wouldn't be discriminated by moving to another country, full stop, not because it's nice to have people being not discriminated. And I think this is very much at the very core of how Europe is being built today. The other thing, but I mean, doesn't mean that we have to despair. I mean, we have to keep making the arguments, but we have also to be honest in the efficiency of this argument. The second thing I wanted to highlight, because it's still about the racialization of Muslims. And this is the case in France, the difference of perceptions between Arab Muslims and Black Muslims, and how it has been framed in the discourse. I think for a long time, until very recently, that French realized that, hey, a number of sub-Saharan migrants, or migrants with sub-Saharan descent, were actually Muslims, and they never made the connections between the two. And a few days ago, I was on a panel with a really great activist called Rokhaya Diallo. Maybe you know her. I mean, she's been founding an organization which is called the Indivisibles, if I can say, referring to the invisibility of the French people. And so she's really a prominent speaker for racial equality in the media. So she's a journalist herself, and she's only profiled as black, but she's Muslim. So it's like if she cannot fit in two boxes in the French mind. I mean, either you're one or the other, because it doesn't work. I mean, which is good in a way, because she's black, she can also speak about Muslim issues, like not being considered as a Muslim and having a more legitimate voice to do so, which is a bit paradoxical, but that's how it is. But it went as far in the debate about polygamy. It has been extremely interesting to see how it works. So, I mean, it has been a countdown a little bit in France since a couple of years, but a few years back, there was a whole stuff going on polygamy, the fact that Muslims were marrying more than one women, and this kind of stuff, and it was only linked to Arabs, right? And even in conservative neighborhoods, you had, I would say not the mayor, but the local authorities responsible for social housing, having no problems in renting flats, 2 flats, and the walls in between were just laid down for black African polygamists living with, usually it was 2 or 3 women and the kids. And it has never ever been a subject of discussion. That was okay. Yeah, and why, in the Arab side, I would say Arab Muslim, cases of polygamy are extremely rare. I mean, to be honest, there are cases of very interesting types of polygamy and, I would say, religious marriages and so on, but this is a new phenomenon which has been developing rather recently. So it's not official polygamy that was really at the core of the debate. So it's interesting to see how also Muslimness is constructed in relation to specific ethnicities. So it has not been the case in the US. I think it's very specific to France, but it's really worth looking into this kind of disconnect again when we start talking about those kind of very specific issues.
We had a little event last night on television involving a couple of people. And despite the focus on domestic policy, you never got around to talking about immigration, at least not last night, but hopefully in the next couple of weeks. But that brings us to another direction here, which is how do immigration policies affect elections? And when we look at the United States over the past several years, of course, we see fear as a big component. But then this year we saw deferred action also kind of make its way, maybe because of other factors involved that affect elections. So I'm going to pass this on to you, Tony, for comment.
So, pre-election 2008, all the national polling data, looking at the split among Latinos for Obama and McCain. It was about 10-to-1 favorability rating, right? And the question was, of the two candidates, who has more concern for Latinos? And I think 60% said Barack, 10% or something said McCain, and the other said equal concern, no difference between the two, right? And indeed, in the election, I think Obama carried 2/3 of Latinos in 2008. Within 2 years of that election, his approval rating among Latinos fell to just a couple points above the national average, 48%. Record lows. What happened? Well, it turned out that in spite of some very sort of lofty campaign promises about immigration reform and the DREAM Act and all these other things, what actually happened at the end of the day was rates of ICE raids and deportations that were between double and triple the rates they had been under George W. Bush. And it turned out, shockingly, that some Latinos were not pleased with this particular development, and were indeed, I think, responding in kind in these polls and surveys. Now, what do we know? The raids hit their sort of highest levels in 2011. We're setting a fairly robust clip this year. And then, a few months before the upcoming election, the Obama administration issues a statement saying that they're going to suspend deportations. That by executive order, he's going to implement some of the policies that were prescribed in the stalled DREAM Act. Right? And whether you consider that a sort of shameless pander or a sort of brilliant tactical move, the evidence is fairly clear. According to the latest Gallup poll, Barack is now pulling a 50-point net advantage over Romney in the upcoming election. I think the split's now sitting at 70-20. So in terms of the role on elections, the policy language has probably one of the clearest impacts we've ever seen.
And Governor Romney has announced what this past week.
Oh, God, what was his latest? Do I want to know? Well, did he know the camera was running?
No, he has said that he would not get rid of deferred action right away. It's like the first 2-year cycle.
Right.
For the same, I guess, pandering, if you would say.
And that one has some interesting roots, because when you think about the sort of identity crisis among Republicans, this category that pools fiscal conservatives, Tea Party folks, like a lot of really, really different individuals under a common heading, right? There was a sort of old running joke about the border fence when it went up, that there would be 2 signs on the border fence, one that said "keep out," and then another one that said "help wanted." And a lot of us, sort of thought that was a funny joke until it turned out that one of the subcontractors building the border fence was actually fired for employing undocumented workers to build the fence.
I think the issue of Latinos and the vote is an interesting one in American politics. So what we see now is just the population is getting less white right now, and the Republican Party is clearly appealing to the white voter. So some of the Republican strategists have said that Romney can win with 61% of the white vote, because less than that he won't win. And they also said this is the last time a Republican can really have a chance at winning by mostly crafting his appeal or her appeal to the white vote. It's the last time they try to do so, but they won't be able to come close anymore in an election. So because Hispanics are no longer concentrated in just 2 states, right? That once you have Hispanics spreading across the country, and now so North Carolina has gone in 20 years, I think my colleague just told me, from 90% whites voting to 70%. And so that's clearly a huge difference. So as this continues, this is one of the reasons why Pennsylvania has become more democratic, is influx of Latinos. So as this spreads across the country, the issue of how you deal with immigrants is going to become an important one, because it's important to the Latino community. So to the degree that the Republicans are seen by Latinos on the wrong side of the issue, it's going to really harm their chances for election on a national basis. It may often play well locally, in particular local elections. So you're going to have, I think, not immediately, but at some point, a fight within the Republican Party between people who gain votes from being anti-immigrant and Republicans who have a more national perspective who say, hey, you're going to win the House district here, but you're going to keep losing the presidency. So I think politically, this is the next frontier. So Arizona will probably vote for Republican this time, but next time around, I'd certainly bet for the Democrats. So I think this is the issue. Sorry, what?
Texas?
Texas, I don't know, but 10, 12 years from now, I mean, I don't know exactly when, but 10 years from now, 12 years from now, and if you're a Republican strategist and you say, well, we're not going to carry Texas in the national election, you're not going to win, because you don't have New York and you don't have California, and if you lose Texas too, then you have no chance. So once Texas hits that tipping point, the Republican national elections, they'll have to change, or they'll just be a minority party for a long time. But political parties, even ones you don't like, are in the long run rational, right? So in the short and medium term, they might not change, but eventually they don't have to attract the majority Latino vote, but they can't attract 20% and win nationally. They have to get, I don't know what the number is, 35, 40, something in that area to be a competitive party nationally. And so once they lose Texas, then and they know this, they're thinking about it. But right now their base is pushing them away from this, and so this is their problem right now.
Well, on Europe, no, I think it's again, yes, the migration debate is an impact on lawmaking. That's definitely something that we see. And I was mentioning already the disconnect between the actual needs in terms of what the society and the economy needs in terms of migrants to be able to sustain a certain level of living. So that's definitely the case for more migration is there. But what we've seen since say 5, 6, maybe at least 5, 6, 7 years. So it's a great increase in terms of production of law with the European level in the field of migration. I mean, it's definitely one of the area of the policy area of the European Union that is the most productive in terms of legislation. And what we see, and it's really problematic for us, is a clusterization of migrants in different types of categories with different types of rights. So there is the circular migration, the seasonal workers, then the higher skilled workers who can have the blue card, and so all of category of migrants has different sets of rights and duties. So for us, I mean, trying to articulate a human rights-based approach and saying, well, everybody should have the same rights, basically, that's really problematic. And the problem is that the Commission argues that it's better to do it that way, so at least people have a minimum set of rights, depending on the category they are in, rather than having no rights in certain countries. So, I mean, this argument of the minimum standard is good in a way for some countries, but of course it doesn't imply other more progressive countries to do more. So that's really an issue that we face. But the thing is, and these are also where we always do not understand how the logics are being done there and what are the interests at stake, is that there is a directive currently in the pipeline about intra-corporate, I don't think they say migrants, but basically it's a directive that would concern a few hundred people in the EU. So we don't understand how, I mean, we see the objective cost of getting a directive or piece of legislation through the whole process. I mean, it costs millions of euros basically in terms of staff and people drafting, all the lobbyists around it, how also to put money to work. So, I mean, all these efforts are making moves, a huge machinery, so that, for example, an Indian company could post one of its high executives in Brussels for a number of years, and having all sorts of advantages and rights different from the one of normal migrant workers and so on. So that's very interesting to see that they go to this kind of level of details that do really concern a few hundreds of people. But again, with a very strange way of looking at things. I mean, for example, if you look at those high-level executives, there is nothing in the current proposal about family life. So they come for 3 years. So what? And what do they do? No item outside of the work. And really it's an issue. They don't even think how those people are going to live then. I mean, that's creating also other problems just in that sense. So definitely, yes. I mean, migration, the debate on migration is a huge political impact on the lawmaking process.
Can I add one thing? Because I am European after all. I'm from Germany. I think the thing that's the most striking is how most of the right-wing parties in European countries over the last 10 years have won increasing numbers of votes on an anti-immigration platform, and how much more acceptable it has become to say racist and xenophobic things in election campaigns. I wasn't in Germany until 2001. And I remember the shift in the 1990s where things that were initially really only acceptable to say on the very right fringe of certain parties, and there were still sort of legal questions, especially in Germany, about neo-Nazi parties and whether they could actually be part of the political spectrum at all. And into the 1990s, you have sort of the trickling of that rhetoric into the mainstream. And now it is mainstream political parties, at least in Germany, who can express anti-immigrant sentiments in ways that weren't possible in 1995. And so I think that's a really big concern, because of course it naturalizes racism and anti-immigration sentiments and makes it possible to use them in these ways like they're used here for political gain. And in the process they reinforce tendencies that certain societies I think already have, or historically already have.
Thank you. I think we want to take some time and get some questions from the audience. So I'm wondering if we can pass this mic around and see if we can get some questions of our panelists from down here. Anybody have a question? Yes. Yeah. This thing only goes so far.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Pleasance, and I'm with the Transatlantic Master's Program here at UNCG. And my question really has two parts to it, and anyone can answer it who feels like it. First of all, I know that in a lot of these places, a lot of the countries that we're talking about, the veil or the hijab is not always a religious statement for some women, but it's also a personal statement. It's a cultural statement. So they're wearing it not to represent their religion, but because they like it, just because that's their choice. That's the first part. And then the second part of the question is, we can see in pictures and in the news now that it's becoming a fashion statement as well, even among, I guess, non-Muslim women, or women who don't look Muslim, so to speak. And I'm wondering if this new trend is positive, if it's better, because we can see that a lot of non-Muslim women are wearing it, and it seems like a good thing, or if it's negative, because it seems like some sort of, I don't know, Islamic contagion that's spreading around. So I'm wondering what your opinions are on that.
One of you.
These are really excellent questions that really, I think, very hard to answer. It's a huge debate, as you probably can imagine or you are aware of what veiling means, first among Muslim women. And you're absolutely right to point out that, it's not just about religion. I mean, religion is absolutely one reason, but it's certainly not the only reason. And that there are a variety of political, economic, personal, cultural reasons for wearing it. But I think that this variety of reasons is precisely one of the things that is not understood among the general public, whether in the US or in Europe or anywhere really. Because I think that there is that tendency of categorizing and of defining Muslimness, as has been said, and so Muslimness is thought to be as one thing, and one thing only, and only certain types of veiling is considered authentic, and anything else that is not is not considered veiling by some groups. So, and that's precisely one of the reasons why Muslim women in particular are both being attacked from the outside for being backward and religious and pious and, and subservient, and from the inside for not being veiling properly enough. And so, so I think that that's one thing. And then the question of fashion, that's a big also debate in terms of can piety exist with fashion? Can you be both fashionable and pious, or is that a contradiction in terms? And also, is fashion, because it's also perceived as coming from Muslim minority society, from Europe, from America, then represents the contagious evil doings of another empire that is taking over Muslim societies. So I think that for some, on one side of the spectrum, this is considered as a bad thing. And of course, on the other side of the spectrum is considered as, no, it's a form of identity, of individualism, and of personal expression that should be viewed as valid and in a way that can put in question and challenge those very stereotypical views of veiling. But I think that the one thing that also is not often brought into the discussion is the economic benefits that Europe has from this whole economy of veiling. All of the big industry, all of the luxury groups, Prada, Christian Dior, Yves Saint Laurent, all of them make a huge amount of money from selling veils and abayas and Islamic design dress with even copyrights and diamonds and and embroideries for Muslim women in the Gulf they're redesigning some of their own dresses that they are selling in Europe with sleeves for the Gulf and Saudi Arabia, and because they recognize that this is a huge untapped economic wealth that they could be getting. And so, and at the same time, so Europe, on the one hand, from one side, is very much enjoying all of these economic benefits, and on the other side, is completely rejecting and presenting itself as secular when it's on its own ground. Now, what I personally think, I'm not sure. I mean, I go back and forth. It's really a complicated issue, so I'm more fascinated by the debate. And I always ask my students what they think. I think that a lot of my students feel that ultimately fashion and veiling can actually become a very positive lead to positive integration, or a normalizing of what veiling is, because I think that it's something that they can relate to. So that this is the very younger generation, I think, that is perceiving that. But it has a problem also of commodifying the body. And so it's a two-way street. I mean, I don't think that there's just one way of looking at this. This is why it's so hard to answer your question, which is very good.
I mean, of course, there's an American Muslim hijab fashion market too. It's smaller, and doesn't involve as many sort of brand name companies. It sort of comes more from communities. For non-Muslim women to start wearing what would be identified as hijab, at least in the American context, would be a disadvantage because women who wear hijab are routinely excluded in all kinds of ways. And at the same time, so I think many Muslim women would say, yes, there is a debate, and we have internal debates about how women dress and what's appropriate and what's not. And of course, every debate, and I think this is important to remember, in a Muslim community, in a minority context, takes place under the public gaze. There's nothing that happens in Muslim communities that people on the outside, so to speak, don't already know about. And that changes the dynamics of those kinds of debates tremendously, I would argue. I just wanted to bring in, somebody took the time, somebody who knows more about the American legal system than I do, took the time a number of years ago to look into cases where women went to court claiming religious discrimination because of hijab. And what struck me the most out of that essay that was the result of that study was that, yes, there is the upholding of religious freedom, the freedom to wear what you want to wear, except when it collides with business interests. So if an employer, for example, can make the argument that a woman with hijab is going to be bad for his business because if she works at the front desk and people come in and get scared because women have bombs under their hijabs, then he would win the court case because business interest trumps religious freedom. And I thought that was really telling because it's a good representation of the logic we have at work here. There's a lot of discussion about religious freedom and Muslims being allowed to practice their religion freely like everybody else, but within limits. So one of them is business and the other one is national security, right? And so, and there are different dynamics at work. So I don't think there's ever going to be a ban on hijab in America. I doubt that that's sort of the way to go. But there are many and sometimes not so subtle ways in which there are limitations that are put on Muslim women and their, like their ability to find jobs and their ability to get an education and various other kinds of things like that. Yeah.
Just wanted to say a few words. I think what is interesting as well, as a complement to what you've been saying, both of you, I mean, to bring a little bit more of nuance in the debate is the entry and exits of wearing the hijab. Often it's perceived in the majority community that once women wear their hijab, it's something gone for life. But absolutely not. So it can be just for a period of life and then leave it, come back again in a different shape, maybe more fashionable, maybe less. So it's really something so personal that is changing all the time. And I think that it should be more brought to the light that it's not a definitive choice. It's not like a retreat out of the world. I mean,
More questions?
Yes, can you step up, please?
Can everyone hear me? I've got a pretty booming voice.
All right.
Yeah, save me some steps. We've heard about how the immigration issue is gendered for Muslims, both women and men. I was wondering if anyone could comment on some of the gender issues dealing with Latino and Latina immigrants.
Okay. Tony, can you?
Yeah, sorry, by anyone I meant you.
So, I think like sort of any other migrant stream where there is a really imbalanced sex ratio, typically those that are driven by labor supply and flows of labor supply, you see a sort of unique set of issues, particularly in sort of media portrayals. But also just in sort of, the sort of normal, sort of usual, I think, inevitable demographic waves, right? So if we look at a lot of these sort of high-profile hate crimes that have taken place in the last few years in Pennsylvania, upstate New York, they actually had a term for it when racist would-be evildoers go out specifically with ethnic targets in mind. Anyone ever heard the term beaner bashing or beaner jumping? All right, this is this new phenomenon, essentially going out to look for someone who looks Mexican or Latino, and basically jumping the person for fun. Right. And then some of the most high-profile incidents, they don't stop there. Right. There have been several Latino immigrants killed in recent years. And actually, I believe one of the half a dozen or so killed in New York was actually Mexican. All the rest were Salvadorian, Guatemalan, right, Honduran. So there's never been a lot of logic or even, sort of valid recognition for hate crimes. But some of these things are highly, highly gendered. Several in Pennsylvania were thought to have been exacerbated by the fact that the immigrant who was targeted had a Caucasian girlfriend at the time, and this was generally frowned upon. And again, because you have a very, very imbalanced sex ratio in migratory flows, right? There's going to be sort of interracial and interethnic pairings, right? It's sort of inevitable. And in some instances, this sort of exacerbates some of the tensions that would otherwise be there. We saw similar things with a lot of these sort of anti-Chinese sentiment in California in the early 19th century, in large part because it was lots of men coming over, right? And the few Chinese women that weren't sent over were primarily being marketed in the oldest of occupations. This was generally frowned upon as well.
So, just hanging on with the Latinas here, I just wrote an article for the Southeastern Geographer on Latinas who are playing on soccer teams in the Triangle and in the Triad area. This is a really fascinating phenomenon that's happening. We know that in the Latino community there are these giant soccer leagues where the men play, and they play on Sundays, and they play all day, and they have an awful lot of steam, and so forth. What's been happening recently is that women have joined and have formed their own teams and are playing in their own leagues in very, very great numbers that people don't really know about unless you really know the community. And we're talking about women who are not teenagers, we're not talking about youth soccer, but rather women who are mothers who have standing in the community and are participating in a very different role within their family and their culture and their community, and I think it's really fascinating. It's sort of an integration, but integration on their own terms, because in their own countries in Mexico or in Central America, they would never have played, they would never have kicked the ball on a field or wear a uniform or a number. But here in the United States, they've come and they are picking up and sort of redefining this third space that exists on soccer fields for the men. What the managers or the owners of these leagues or ligas have discovered, of course, is that when women play, they bring all of their family. And then they make so much more money on concessions and food and things like that. So there's an economic incentive now for the leagues to incorporate women teams and leagues and championships and trophies and all this other stuff. More questions? Yes?
Hi, my name is Samantha Tropper. I'm a senior at Duke University. And Ms. Hammer was discussing the idea that business concerns trump religious freedom in America in those court cases. And I'm wondering, perhaps Ms. Hammer or Mr. Privot can answer this, but in France, in the context of France, and the idea of laïcité, or the French version of secularism, would the idea of laïcité, or working toward a common good and toward working for the republic, trump religious freedom in France? And that's why we have things like the burqa ban and the 2004 law against ostentatious signs of religion in schools.
Can you repeat what the argument of laïcité trump religious freedom? Yeah.
Well, yeah.
I
mean,
it does.
That seems obvious, but why is that like okay?
It's not.
It's not. I mean, why is it accepted though, and the international community is doing nothing to kind of stop this?
Why is the international community not doing anything to stop it? Okay, that's for you.
I was just opening my mouth to think about it.
It's just considered a domestic issue. I mean, you know, you're not going to get a boy. I don't know. I mean, what do you think?
I think it's a violation of human rights. So other countries, under things like the UDHR, have an obligation to have a duty to intervene in situations where violations of human rights are happening. So why is no one doing anything?
Well, there are a few aspects there. I mean, for there is a CERT, yeah, and the CERT has no coercive power. So basically, they report about what's happening in France, and they make nice reports, and that's it. And the government say French. The government say I don't care. There has been only, I think there was one case. Well, the thing is that because of the law, it needs to be challenged in front of the courts. Basically, so everybody kind of agrees that there's an issue there. But you have to have people that are interested to go to court and challenge the law. The law of 2004 banning the veil in France has so far not been challenged by Muslims in court because they're extremely reluctant and they don't feel that they have enough data and enough evidence to be able to the European Court of Human Rights. With the only preceding issue that has been about the hijab was the case of Turkey, Shaheen vs. Turkey, I think, and the last, and where, of course, the court ruled in favor of Turkey in a very highly questionable type of judgment where there was a Turkish judge and he was the one who was making the split vote, basically. So now it's for many human rights defenders, we tend to be careful before we go there. And then for the case of the burqa ban, let's say it that way, I'm not aware today that they have proceedings in court against it by people that would feel discriminated for that. Contrary in Belgium, so Belgium has also enforced the burqa ban, and there are 5 court cases in front of the Constitutional Court. So there is, in those cases, there is no possibility for an external intervention to say that's wrong. It has to come from the grassroots and challenge step by step to the highest court. But it's definitely questionable. But it gives me the opportunity to come back to what you say about the business interest trampling religious freedom in the US. Maybe it's not that strong in the EU, or maybe I don't know, but I mean, at least, religion is protected in the field of employment. But it's always a very kind of thin balance, could I say that, to achieve delicate balance? Thank you very much. Delicate balance to achieve, and so far we have very few cases. I.e., not any individual is free to practice his religion as long as it doesn't go against the interests of the business. So, and very interestingly, most of the codes, labor codes, this practice of religion is often linked to the practice of civil rights. So, i.e., going to vote and so forth. In a number of countries, this can also be suspended if there is a genuine business interest that has to be demonstrated by the business. So it's often not used so far. We're still waiting for it, but there are some cases that are not definitely encouraging in the sense that we increasingly see that judges are, there's this perception, I don't know in the US, but definitely in Europe, that judges are kind of some sort of neutral media through which the general law is passing and being applied to specific and particular cases. And in those cases of religious discrimination, we increasingly see that judges are definitely biased. They are mostly white male majority. And definitely there's an impact on how they do perceive those kind of issues, and this is kind of really widespread in Europe, so it's not encouraging in that sense.
Let me just say very briefly that, that the potential that a European court can overturn a domestic law, but the chances that an international court is that you're going to have a case against a major Western European power in an international court, you have almost no chance. Or any major power, Western or not. The politics of it is such that it's just not going to happen, at least not now, maybe at some point. It's small countries, Serbia, their people go to international, but not France, not the United States, not China, not Russia. That's just the politics of it, it's just not going to happen. European courts are different. European courts have overruled domestic laws of European countries.
The thing is,
yes, but not international.
But the thing is to say that we have been facing, specifically in the case of Roma in Eastern Europe, I mean, there have been numerous court cases,
ignored, I'm sure.
Nothing has been happening. So even countries don't care about the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. So it's not encouraging.
I think we have time for just one more question. Yes.
I'll just make a very, very small comment. Following the last question is that we also have to remember that it's not black and white. And I agree that the court is made with all white male, but there are groups also in France of women of Arab descent and who participate in Muslim culture, whether they're practicing or not, who are against the wearing of the hijab and who support the law of the ban of the hijab. So, you know, it's more complicated than having women who are being victimized by a law. There are also women of Muslim or Arab descent who support the law because they want to be active participant in society, or because for religious reasons they don't want to participate in the debate or in wearing the hijab, or who also believe that maybe they can be Muslim without wearing the hijab. So there are other voices and also in those communities who support the ban. So it's not all black and white. You know, this is why I think the human rights wouldn't work, because these women would also feel stigmatized, you know, as a lot of them claim or say that they are feminists. They will also feel very stigmatized if their voices were not heard. And they were demonstrating in the street of Paris in favor of the ban. So it's complicated. There are a lot of different voices around that. You know.
Some voices just are more often heard than others.
That's right.
Yeah. Do we have one last question? Yes. Let's go for it. Go.
Hey, my name is Faisal Abdul-Rahman. I'm with the TAM program at UNC Chapel Hill. Just to respond, not to respond, I have a question, but there are different, with the hijab thing, I also did a bit of studying about it myself. I know that some women were in favor of it. My question is more tied down to the idea that you mentioned that women are spoken about, but a lot of times they don't have a voice in it. I know some women were in favor of it, some women weren't in favor of it, but on the whole, their voices weren't really incorporated in the debate. I would argue that myself that telling a woman what she can't wear is no different than telling a woman in Saudi Arabia that she has to wear this. Why is it that women, or Muslim women in general, at least in Europe, don't have any kind of voice, and are there groups that, it seems like it's either a group like yours that, you know, will work for them, or a group that's trying to oppress, or whatever you want to call it. Who speaks for the women, and can the women speak for themselves?
So I've done quite a bit of work on the representations of Muslim women in the media, in the American media in particular, less so on Europe. And I think that there are several things. One of them is, of course, there are plenty of educated, well-spoken, outspoken Muslim women who participate in society in all the ways that you can imagine. There's nothing that's preventing them from that. And it's not that there are no spaces for Muslim women to express themselves and represent themselves. I would argue that once they decide to do that, and they have done that in a variety of ways, the biggest obstacle is that they will only be heard if they say the things that are expected of them. So in media studies, those are frames, and the frames for Muslim women are already there. The most important one is the liberated, well-spoken Muslim woman who has liberated herself from a number of things, usually the patriarchy of her religion, preferably the hijab. It's better if she used to wear it and then took it off because that is, no really, that sells much better. It does. It can also be the, oh, she can actually speak even though she is wearing the hijab. But there is a tendency, and I've surveyed pretty much everything that American Muslim women have written since the 1960s for a project that I've been working, that I worked on. And what you find is in like a mind-boggling number of progressive, liberal, liberated Muslim women. We have almost nothing in terms of memoirs, literature, journalism outside of Muslim communities and Muslim websites by women who don't fit that profile. So what we don't have is representations, self-representation of Muslim women who we would identify as conservative, pious, overly religious, and all those kinds of things. And I think in part that is because when the frame is not filled, there will be no distribution. Of course, in part it is also because those women might not be as interested in what the public thinks about them. They might really not give a damn and not want to write a memoir that then sells on HarperCollins, right? So like there's sort of, there are different dynamics to that. But like with the debate about whether Muslims have said enough about being against terrorism, the thing that always comes up in debates is that the moderate Muslims, and I use this term very cautiously because the American government has a very particular idea of what that means and why that needs to be supported. If moderate Muslims, so the charge is moderate Muslims don't speak out enough. Post 9/11, before 9/11, whenever something happens, the innocence of Muslims, like what, 2 weeks ago. And the problem is not that they're not speaking out, the problem is that nobody's listening because it's not particularly interesting when you compare it to people burning flags and attacking embassies, right? And so there's sort of a way in which it's not the media that is sort of the evil empire, but it is very important to recognize that self-representation is both linked to politics and to politics of media production. And within that, it can be very difficult to be something outside of what people expect from you.
No, I completely understand. I think that Michaël has said something in my class about that might, I mean, I don't want to repeat what you said, so you can say. Why we don't hear the voices of many of the Muslims who do not fit the frame, as she said. And I think that there is definitely something to be said about that in the Stasi Commission that decided about how to integrate Muslims and which led to the adoption of the law. There was not one single woman or one even single sociologist who studied the situation of the women was part of that commission. So clearly there is a desire not to hear certain voices and only hear some others. But I think you were also talking about the fact that, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, I think definitely that it's very interesting to see that as soon as you choose to wear a hijab and you want to go in the media, the voice exists in the community. We're very strong, outspoken women in that, but if you wear a hijab, you're considered conservative, we will say Islamist. So basically you have to be banned because your voice is legitimate. You are here to convert the people and everything. So basically, I mean, there is no box for you within the media landscape. But one thing that I was also discussing with in Sahara's class yesterday is that when we look internally within the dynamics within the Muslim communities, it's also extremely difficult to find people that are willing to go to the front for various reasons. I mean, so of course, one of the things is that if you are willing to go to the front, and I mean, you will face, of course, difficulty, provided that they find a slot for you in the mainstream media. So that would already be very hard. But even if you were to be going there, you would have to. I mean, if you want to have a really articulated discourse and try to really balance and so on, you will face definitely opposition from the majority society with no back from the stage, and you will face also the problem in issues within your own community because you will not have been enough in that sense. And we have cases in Europe where even Muslim women that were not specifically really, never had even claimed to represent anyone but herself. I mean, well, in the stories that she wear the veil, and because of that she was excluded from a political party where she was very strong and everything. And of course, for most of them, there was a media storm around her. And I would say that the media were, well, we had trained her well, so I mean, she knew how to deal with that, and I think that she managed to get the media attention in a positive sense, and they were really sensitive to her issue and how she'd been victimized in the party. So I mean, that was really great. But within the community, when she went back, it was like, your hijab is not good enough, you are not dressed well enough, your skirt is not long enough, and blah, blah, blah. So they were not even caring about what is in the debate and in terms of her relationship and everything, but rather targeting her on very superficial issues. So we've seen this, it's extremely difficult then, I mean, to really motivate people to say, okay, just go to the front, we need more people like you because you will show the diversity of Muslim communities, I mean, in all the spectrum of possible options that might exist. And it's extremely difficult to generate it, and there is this global mistrust also towards the media. I'm often called by journalists that want to have contacts with Muslim communities because they are making, I mean, those journalists are really genuinely interested, and I know they will make good reports, and they can't find someone to talk to, and specifically they want specifically to talk to Muslim women. First, they accept and they then cancel. It's the most often scheme, and I've heard more than once. I mean, report projects that have been just dropped because they could not find people willing to talk to. So at a certain point, you can also blame the media portrayal of Muslims from a Muslim perspective, but also then that is the media. Definitely, that's also an humanitarian impact.
Okay, we've reached the end of our time. I think the panel deserves a round of applause.